Robert Earl Clarke, the pride of Flin Flon, Manitoba, Canada, recipient of the Order of Canada, a 15-year career in the National Hockey League, the face of the Philadelphia Flyers, selected to 9 All-Star appearances, 1 Selke Award for Best Defensive Forward, 1 Ted Lindsay Award, 3 Hart Trophies, and 2 Stanley Cups. His number 16 hangs from the rafters at Wells Fargo Center in Philadelphia. He finished his career 11th all-time in points in the NHL, now 46th. He still to this day leads the Flyers all-time in games played in both the regular season and in the playoffs. He was a first ballot Hall of Famer. But was he a good GM? From 1994 to 2006, Clarke led the way for the Flyers, and while he is still there to this day in a different role and will always be beloved by the Philly faithful, is he remembered positively as a GM? More importantly, should he be? Well, today we take a look at one major aspect of being an NHL general manager, that being trading. And while it doesn't tell the whole story, as certain signings and a certain Eric Lindros debacle can attest to, as Peter Chiarelli can tell you, it doesn't take too many mistakes when it comes to trading to ruin one's reputation. The Flyers made the playoffs for all 11 years that Clarke was at the helm, but there is a glaring omission to that record. Only 1 Stanley Cup Finals appearance, that being a loss. So how does the trade record stack up? Well, simply put, we're going to take a look at every single trade that he made, grading the deal as either a win, a loss, or a tie. The first 2 are obvious, but when it comes to the tie, that will be used for deals that were either inconsequential or actually a tie where it benefited both teams. And there are a lot of trades that ultimately were inconsequential, so expect a lot of ties through, again, over a decade-long tenure with a team. So with that said, let's get down to business. Trade number 1, June 29th of 1994. The Montreal Canadiens acquire Yves Racine in exchange for Kevin Haller. Racine ultimately not on the Habs for that long. That's the only real way to describe it. He played 47 games for Montreal before moving on to the San Jose Sharks. Kevin Haller, ultimately a part of another trade involving the Flyers, of course, but with this tenure at least, played 2 seasons before being dealt later on in the 96-97 season. We'll talk about that trade a little bit later on. So when you look at this deal, if you wanted to give a victory to one side, you would probably lean towards Philadelphia for getting the better player, for someone who stuck around a little bit longer, but ultimately, this is going to go down as an inconsequential trade. Again, the first of many, it's a tie. Trade number 2, September 6th of 1994, the Tampa Bay Lightning acquire Alex Selivanov, Alex, in exchange for a 1995 4th-round pick that eventually became Radovan Somik. Again, this deal goes down as a tie. Somik eventually played for the Flyers, but not for a while. Ultimately, though, again, neither player that big of an impact player. You'll get an example of an impact trade with the very next deal that we're going to talk about, but for now, another inconsequential trade. September 22nd of 1994, the Philadelphia Flyers acquire Ron Hextall and a 1995 6th-round pick that ultimately became Dmitry Turchiny, in exchange for Tommy Soderstrom. Now, 2 familiar names for fans, of the 80s and 90s. Tommy Soderstrom, not a bad goaltender, but ultimately didn't hang around the NHL for all that long. I mean, again, you look at a .902 save percentage in 94, 95. It wasn't bad for the time, but this is Ron Hextall. This is one of the goaltenders you think of when it comes to the Philadelphia Flyers. He, Bernie Parent, perhaps Ilya Bryzgalov, and the fact that the universe is humongous big. This is a win for the Flyers, no doubt about it. Next up, we have another throwaway trade. February 2nd of 1995, the Tampa Bay Lightning acquire Scott LeGrand in exchange for Mike Greenlay. Not really going to tell you anything more about the deal. It's a throwaway. 7 days later, February 9th, 1995, the Montreal Canadiens acquire Mark Recchi and a 3rd-round pick in 95 that became Martin Hohenberger in exchange for Eric Desjardins, Gilbert Dion, or perhaps Gilbert Dion, and John LeClair. Now, I love Mark Recchi. As a Bruins fan, 2011 comes to mind. I love Mark Recchi. I do. One of the most prolific players in NHL history. He would ultimately stay on Montreal up until the 98-99 season, where he ends up back in Philadelphia. But you want to talk about staples of this Flyers team throughout the next few years as this team continues to make the playoffs. Eric Desjardins and John LeClair were a gigantic part of the team that ultimately made it to the Stanley Cup Finals and continued to be competitive really up until the 2004 lockout. So no doubt another victory here for the Philadelphia Flyers. Next up, we have two more trades that I would define as inconsequential. Montreal acquires Mark Lamb in exchange for cash on February 10th, and 5 days later, the Canucks acquire Josef Baranek in exchange for Sean Antoski. Again, not too much to say about these deals, but that moves us to the very next day, February 16th of 95. Chicago acquires Bob Wilkie and a 5th-round pick that becomes Kyle Calder in exchange for Carl Dykhouse. And simply put, I would define Kyle Calder as the best player in this deal. I mean, granted, the Chicago Blackhawks were not good, while Kyle Calder was one of the best players on the team. But you look at that roster, I mean, some people might argue Carl Dykhouse, but I give it to Kyle Calder, and that is going to be a loss, the first loss for Mr. Clarke. Next up, we have another flurry of inconsequential trades, at least in my opinion. Again, with these deals, you can say, okay, this guy was technically better, but ultimately, are these the big deals that someone's going to be remembered for? No. It's not even going to be one of the smaller deals where it's like, that was the deal. It's not like a Rich Peverly to Boston deal in 2011. Again, I hate to keep bringing up 2011, but it's a primary example. Anaheim acquires Milos Holan in exchange for Anatoly Semenov on March 8th. March 13th, we see Ryan McGill go to Edmonton for Brad Savisha and a 6th-round pick that became Jamie Sokolsky. So that's a deal. April 7th. Now, Gary Galley and Peter Svoboda are both intriguing names. I'd say familiar names from people who, recall watching in the 90s, but ultimately this deal, it wasn't all that important. June 27th, Winnipeg acquires the rights to Jeff Finley in exchange for Russ Romaniuk. And July 8th, again, these deals, like I said, inconsequential. Toronto acquires Rob Zettler in exchange for a 5th-round pick in 1996 that became Per Ragnar Bergqvist, which is a phenomenal name. July 12th, Colorado acquires a 3rd-round pick in 96 that becomes Sean McNeil, and a 6th-round pick in the same year that became Kai Fisher in exchange for Garth Snow, who, it's Garth Snow towards the, really towards the back half of his career. Ultimately, not that crucial of a part for the Flyers. He left the very next year for Vancouver. But then we get to the next deal that was a little bit consequential. The Toronto Maple Leafs acquired Dmitry Yushkevich and a 2nd-round pick that became Francis Larrivee in exchange for a 1st-round pick that became Danis Zubris, 4th-round pick that became Mikhail Simmons, and the pick that ultimately became Jean-Marc Pelletier. Now, simply put, Zubris is a name that a lot of people are going to be familiar with. He had a very long NHL career, up to 20 years later, he'd be that guy in NHL free agent, in NHL franchise mode that you pick up in free agency, but he wasn't a Flyer for that long, whereas Dmitry Yushkevich was a bit of a key part for a Leafs team that continued to be competitive kind of, up until the early 2000s, really before the lockout when things started to go downhill for the Maple Leafs. So I got to give this one to the Leafs just for Dmitry Yushkevich alone. Next up, we have another inconsequential deal. Are you tired of hearing that word yet? September 20th of 95, Winnipeg acquires Andre Faust in exchange for a 7th-round pick that became Andrew Merrick. The next deal, though, is a little bit more interesting. November 16th, San Jose acquires a pick that ultimately became Daniel Briere, a 4th-round pick that became Mike Martone, and the rights to Martin Spaniel in exchange for Pat Falloon. Now, obviously, it's an interesting deal in that San Jose, Danny Briere never played a game for San Jose, of course, started his career with the Coyotes. The Flyers acquire Pat Falloon, who wasn't quite what he used to be at that point, spent a couple of seasons in Philly. I have to give this one to the Flyers, simply because, again, with, what San Jose did with the pick, not keeping Danny Briere. Had they kept Danny Briere, I'd give it to them. But absolutely, this goes down as a win for the Flyers. Next up, December 13th of 95, Dallas acquires Brent Fedek in exchange for Trent Klatt. 2 Hockey Hall of Famers. Clearly not a very big deal. The next deal, though, December 28th, the final deal of 1995, the Hartford Whalers acquire Kevin Dineen in exchange for a 3rd-round pick that became Chris Mallet perhaps, and a 7th-round pick that became Andrew Merrick, ultimately. Yes, that's right, actually. I don't know if that's correct on NHL Trade Tracker's part. But technically, it is the same pick. Yeah, I guess it is. Regardless, this one goes to the Whalers. Kevin Dineen, by far the best player involved in this group, even though, of course, the Whalers would not stay in Hartford for all that much longer. Still have to give it to the Whalers here. Next up, we have another long set of trades that ultimately went nowhere. January 23rd, 1996, Philadelphia acquires Dan Quinn in exchange for cash. Really a nothing deal. Anaheim acquires Chris Herperger, and the pick that became Tony Mohagan in exchange for Bob Corkum. A little bit more of a familiar name, but Corkum wasn't around for that much longer. That's again going to be a draw. Winnipeg acquires Dominic Roussel in exchange for Tim Chevelday, and the pick that became Chester Gallant. Chevelday, not exactly a long-time NHLer. So, yeah, that's a thing. Next up, March 15th, 1996, two very familiar names. The St. Louis Blues acquired Craig McTavish in exchange for Dale Hawerchuk. Now, McTavish wouldn't be a Blue for that long. He'd actually end up back in Philadelphia. Hawerchuk, again, not a Flyer for long, but he was a part of the team that ultimately made it to the Stanley Cup final. So while Hawerchuk, again, wasn't around for that long, he was still useful to this team. That's going to be a win for Philadelphia. What is not a win for Philadelphia is the next trade that they made 4 days later, as they acquire Kerry Huffman in exchange for the pick that ultimately became Sammy Salo. Now, Salo, obviously not exactly known as a Sen, but did spend time on the Sens before being traded to the Vancouver Canucks, after a little bit of time for Peter Schaefer. So I have to give it to the Ottawa Senators on that particular trade. Another long run of trades here. March 19th, we see the Anaheim Ducks acquire Anatoly Semenov and the rights to Mike Crowley in exchange for Brian Wessenberg, perhaps. Semenov, a little bit more well-known, probably the most well-known player out of this deal, but ultimately didn't spend that much time in Anaheim. It actually ended up back as a member of the Philadelphia Flyers. This trade evens out. The LA Kings the same day acquire the pick that became Mikhail Simmons, in exchange for John Druce and the pick that became Todd Fedoruk, which, ultimately, Todd Fedoruk is probably the most notable name of that list. I am going to have that be a draw, though. July 18th, Washington acquires future considerations, it doesn't say what, for Frank Bialowas. Bialowas. That kind of shows you the familiarity. Although former Portland Pirate Frank Bialowas, the pride of Winnipeg. But it's still going to have to be a draw. The next deal, though, December 15th of 96, Hartford acquires Kevin Haller. The first-round pick in 97 became Scott Hannon and Andrew Merrick in exchange for Paul Coffey and the pick that became Chris Mallet. Now, Paul Coffey at this point was not what he used to be, similar to Dale Hawerchuk, but he would appear in the Stanley Cup final with the Flyers that very summer, the beginning of the summer in June, of course. So I got to give that deal to the Flyers. Ultimately, Scott Hannon ended up being a pretty solid defenseman, but you could argue even Paul Coffey towards the back end of his career was the best player in that deal. Next deal, future considerations to the Canucks for František Kučera. That's an even deal. Edmonton acquires a 7th-round pick that became Chad Hins in exchange for Martin Servin. That's another just kind of... You see what I mean about these deals? Dallas acquires a 3rd-round pick that became Steve Gainey in exchange for a 2nd-round pick that became Chris Bala. That's a nothing deal, but oh boy, then do we get to a big time deal. The Tampa Bay Lightning acquire Carl Dykhouse and Mikhail Renberg in exchange for 4 first-round picks, one of the more infamous trades I think there's ever been in the NHL. 1998 first-round pick, that became Simon Gagne. 99 first-round pick, Max Hullet. 2000 first-round pick, Justin Williams. And a 2001 first-round pick that became Tim Gleason. Philadelphia won this trade. My opinion, they win this trade just for Simon Gagne alone, let alone who else was drafted there. This win should be worth like 15 wins. That is still one of the most shocking trades, because you couldn't imagine something like that happening. Even for Connor McDavid to this day, you'd be like, 4 first-round picks. Someone would be like, I have to think about it. Some people would be like, hell no, yes, please. Tampa didn't get back Connor McDavid. The next deal, Jason Bowen to the Oilers in exchange for Brant Myers. Now, Bowen, not an Oiler for all that long, and by that, I mean he played 4 games for them. Brant Myers is an interesting player in that he has 17 bajillion penalty minutes. That's just a fact. It is. Fun fact, he played 1 game for the Bruins in 02-03, had 31 penalty minutes, in the only game he ever played for the Boston Bruins. So for that reason, Philly wins the trade. I'm just kidding. It's obviously an even trade. Next deal, Mike Manaluk in exchange for cash. I mean, Mike, I wish you could say, I mean, really, in theory, it's a win. He played 14 games for the Flyers, but let's be honest, inconsequential. The next deal, though, was interesting. January 17th of 98, the Flyers acquire Alex Daig in exchange for Pat Falloon, Vinny Prospal, and the pick that became Chris Bala. Now, the problem for Alex Daig at this point, it was Alex Daig. He had 37 games for the Flyers that year, 31 the next year, before being dealt to Tampa. Whereas Ottawa, you acquire Pat Falloon. He was only there for 28 games. And for Vinny Prospal, a great career. Spent some time in Ottawa before, of course, bouncing around the league. I have to give it to Ottawa on this one, though. I was tempted to call it a draw, but just for the fact that Vinny Prospal was around for as long as he was, best player in the deal, at least at this point in his career, Ottawa wins this deal as well. Next up, February 5th of 98, the Vancouver Canucks acquire a pick that eventually became Garrett Prosofsky in exchange for Mike Sillinger. Now, Sillinger, of course, known for bouncing around the league, but he was on the Flyers long enough, and you just look at the name. Mike Sillinger against Garrett Prosofsky. The Flyers win this trade. Next up, March 4th of 98, Garth Snow to the Vancouver Canucks in exchange for Sean Burke. Now, you know, I'm surprised at the result of this, but Burke played less than 24 games for the Flyers. He'd go on to have success elsewhere. Garth Snow, though, 2 seasons as a member of the Canucks. I mean, not the greatest in the world, but ultimately this has to go down as a win for Vancouver. You could call it inconsequential ultimately, but I think for the fact that Burke played legitimately 11 games. He was great in those games, but he would ultimately end up going to Phoenix and still bouncing around the league a lot. You could call it inconsequential. I'm going to give it to the Canucks on this one, though. March 24th of 1998, the Edmonton Oilers acquire Yanni Niinimaa in exchange for Dan McGillis and a pick that eventually became Jason Beckett. I gotta be honest, this deal, these defensemen kind of even out. McGillis was on the Flyers for 5 seasons before going to Boston, spending some time in San Jose and ending up back in Philadelphia. Yanni Niinimaa on the Oilers for the next 5 years as well before going to the New York Islanders. It just evens out. Both were solid, effective defensemen at the time. That's an even deal. Next up, same day, Vancouver acquires the pick that became Justin Morrison in exchange for Dave Babich and the pick that became Garrett Prosofsky. That's right. They ended up getting back that pick that they traded to Vancouver in exchange for Mike Sillinger. Ultimately, though, Dave Babich, obviously the biggest name on this list, in this trade. He played 6 games for the Flyers this season, 33 the next before being traded to the LA Kings and then retiring. So if you want to give it to the Flyers for acquiring Dave Babich, you can. I'm going to call it a nothing trade. Speaking of nothing trades, we have more. Nashville acquires Dominic Roussel and Jeff Staples in exchange for a 7th round pick that became Cam Ondrick. That's obviously an even deal. Dallas acquires a 9th round pick that became Jamie Chamberlain in exchange for a 9th that became Sergei Skrobot, the robot. Obviously a nothing deal. Chicago acquires Paul Coffey in exchange for a 5th round pick that became Francis Belanger. Coffey at this point was just about done. He actually had a little bit more gas in the tank, but he only played 10 games for Chicago. So again, kind of similar to the Babich thing. Obviously the bigger name in the trade, but at this point, he played 10 games for Chicago, so that's an even deal. Next up, we have another trade, August 6th, another even deal. Despite San Jose acquiring Johan Hedberg in exchange for Pavel Kasparek, Hedberg, of course, didn't really make his presence known in the league as a member of the Sharks. It was more once he ended up in Pittsburgh. Next deal, August 25th, they acquire a 6th round pick, Scott Selig, I guess, in exchange for Raymond Giroux. 2 gigantic names and another even deal. Edmonton acquires Daniel Lacroix in exchange for Valeri Zelepukin. Zelepukin. Again, this deal you could give as a win for the Flyers if you wanted to. Old Daniel here, Lacroix, we'll call him what you will. He spent a little bit of time in Edmonton, and by that I mean 4 games, whereas Zelepukin was at least decent. Played 74 games for Philadelphia, 25 points, 77 games for Philadelphia, 32 points. But again, it's an inconsequential trade. It really is. You can give it to the Flyers if you want to, but do you really want to be like, yeah, major win there? Not really. The next trade, the Calgary Flames acquire the 3rd-round pick in 1999 that eventually became Patrick Ofiero in exchange for an 8th-round pick that became David Nystrom, the rights to Ryan Bast. Yeah, that's a deal. October 19th, Trent Klatt to Vancouver in exchange for Jeff Dwyer. Another even trade. Mike Manaluk on the move for future considerations. That is another even trade, because of course it is. Next up, November 12th, 1998, Sean, Podine in exchange for Keith Jones. Now, again, with a lot of these deals, you might just be like, okay, not the biggest names. And with some of these trades, of course, I've given the examples of like, does it really matter to name a winner here? You could. What's the point? Keith Jones spent, a season and a half as a member of the Flyers, 2 seasons really. He was okay. But ultimately, Podine was a part of the 0-1 Cup-winning team for the Avalanche, playing 23 games in that postseason. So that is a big-time win for the Colorado Avalanche. Next up, November 17th of 98, Mike Manaluk to the Chicago Blackhawks in exchange for Roman Vopat. That is a nothing trade, of course. But the next deal, December 12th of 98, Chris Gratton and Mike Sillinger to the Tampa Bay Lightning in exchange for Damon Lankow and Mikhail Renberg. And this is, I gotta be honest, a little bit of a tough trade to kind of work out as far as who wins this. I can throw stats at your face if you want me to, but this might be a little bit of a controversial one. But ultimately, Chris Gratton, again, this deal in December of 98. Chris Gratton, like the numbers are okay. He ended up in Buffalo not that long after, and then went back to Tampa. So that, actually, no, he didn't. So yeah, he was in Tampa, and then he ended up in Buffalo for a few seasons. He spent 2 seasons in Tampa. Nothing overly ridiculous. Whereas, again, Mike Sillinger spent the back half of this season and the next season in Tampa before going to Florida. Whereas with Mikhail Renberg, same kind of deal. Spent the next season in Philly, gets traded. Damon Lankow wasn't a Flyer for that long, really. He also ended up as a member of the Coyotes. So some very familiar names, but ultimately I gotta say an even trade because nobody really stuck around. Next up, some more nothing trades at the time. Ultimately, December 28th of 98, Peter Svoboda to Tampa in exchange for Carl Dykhouse. January 8th of 99, Frank Bialos for Dennis Bonvie. Sergei Clementiev to Nashville for future considerations. And Alex Daig to Edmonton in exchange for Andrei Kovalenko. Again, Daig not exactly an Oiler for that long. Never suited up for the Oilers, to be exact. February 10th of 1999, the Pittsburgh Penguins acquire nothing in exchange for Sean O'Brien, who might as well have been nothing. The Hurricanes on March 6th acquire Andrei Kovalenko in exchange for Adam Burt. Again, pretty much a nothing deal. Burt played the rest of that season, played the next year. One of those deals, if you want to name a winner, you can, but meh. Next up, though, we get a pretty big deal, if you ask me. March 10th, the Montreal Canadiens acquire Dinas Zubris, a pick that became Scott Seelig, and another pick that eventually became Matt Karkner, who was a decent defenseman at the time, in exchange for Mark Recchi. Now again, Zubris, not exactly known as a Hab. Played 2 more seasons there before going to Washington. Eventually ended up in New Jersey. Whereas Mark Recchi played in Philadelphia up until the 05-06 season. So Zubris, solid player. Matt Karkner ended up being at least an NHL-level defenseman for a decent amount of time. But Philadelphia acquires Mark Recchi, who still had a lot of gas in the tank at that point. This deal goes to the Flyers. Next up, March 20th of 99, Colin Forbes and a pick that became Michael Lanisek in exchange for Mikhail Anderson and Sandy McCarthy. Now, The most notable name here is probably Sandy McCarthy, who was known for punching faces and doing so very, very well. Played the next season in Philadelphia before moving on to Carolina. Ultimately, I gotta call this a little bit of a draw here. I mean, again, McCarthy might be the most notable name here. He was, we're gonna go with an enforcer, not a goon, because he could put up points. But is this the biggest deal in the world? If you want to name a winner, it's Philadelphia. We're gonna go with inconsequential. Next up, March 23rd of '99, Dave Babich, and the pick that became Nathan Marsters to the LA Kings for Steve Duchesne. Again, another even trade. Duchesne only played 11 games for the Flyers in the regular season, at least 6 playoff games. Dave Babich, we already talked about it, kind of towards the end of his career. So Marsters was the make or break. It broke. Also on March 23rd of '99, Washington acquires cash in exchange for Craig Berube. Now, opinions on Berube aside, the Flyers, I mean, obviously, you could say they won this trade. They probably did. He played the entirety of the next season, played 18 playoff games in the 99-2000 season. Unlike the other deals where it's kind of like, I mean, you at least acquired a useful goon in Craig Berube for nothing. So we'll count that as a win for Philadelphia. May 29th of 1999, the Carolina Hurricanes acquired the pick that eventually became Antti Jokela in exchange for the rights to Francis Lessard. Lessard, a little bit more of a notable name, but again, meh. Vancouver on June 1st acquired the rights to Pat Kavanaugh in exchange for Konstantin Rudenko. Again, meh. September 27th, Nashville acquires Paul Healy in exchange for Matt Henderson. Again, say it with me now, meh. October 15th, Atlanta acquires cash in exchange for Jody Hull. Meh. I mean, Hull was there for 1 season? 2 seasons, actually, because this was an off-season trade. 3. He was there for 3 years, No, I was wrong. No, that's a win. That's a win for Philly. You at least get a useful player in Jody Hull for nothing. That is a little bit of a win. Kind of a toss-up win, but that's a win. October 20th, Montreal acquires Carl Dykhouse in exchange for future considerations. Dykhouse was actually a member of the Habs pretty much up until the lockout from this point on, so I got to give this as a win to Montreal. Admittedly, has me wondering the last trade that he was involved in, really what that deal was. That was not the Recchi deal. I may have made a mistake on that last deal, but you know what? I don't think it's going to condemn either side if it should have actually been a win or a loss to say a Dykhouse trade was, a big thing. November 16th of '99, Nashville gets a conditional pick that was never used in exchange for Steve Washburn, who played 3-4 games for the Philadelphia Flyers over 2 seasons. That is about as meh as it gets, if you ask me. That is pretty damn meh, if you ask me. December 9th of '99, Atlanta acquires Brian Wessenberg in exchange for Eric Bertrand. Wessenberg never played a game for Atlanta, and Bertrand, you didn't play a game for Philadelphia. That's about as meh as it gets. However, then we get to one of the big L's for the Flyers. January 23rd of 2000, Carolina acquires Rod Brind'Amour, Jean-Marc Pelletier, and a pick that became Agris Savalets. He has to be Latvian. Can we confirm that he is Latvian? Confirmed Latvian. Agris Savils. Agris. Good on you. Former second round pick, of course. The Flyers acquired Keith Primo and Christopher Ottoson, not Chris Christopherson. Look, I like Keith Primo a lot. Keith Primo was a hell of a player. He was. Spent the rest of his years in Philadelphia. Really strong player. Used to put up 70. He had a couple of 70-point seasons. But Rod Brind'Amour and what he's meant to that Hurricanes franchise. 2 Cup Finals appearances with that team. 1 win. I mean, the Hurricanes, who knows what the Hurricanes would look like had it not been for Rod Brind'Amour and his importance to that franchise. That is a gigantic win for the Hurricanes ultimately. Next trade, 3 days later, January 26th of 2000, Chicago gets nothing in exchange for Todd White, who played 3 games for the Flyers, would go on to success, a little bit of success later on in his career, 50, 60-point seasons as a member of the Ottawa Senators. Eventually played in Atlanta as well, had a 73-point season, but for the moment, for what this deal meant, it's going to be a draw. White would go on to success later on, though. February 14th, Valentine's Day, 2000, Nashville acquires Eric Bertrand for future considerations. It's pretty bad when Nashville doesn't win this trade, considering Philly got nothing in return. It's a tie. Next up, February 15th of 2000, Philadelphia acquires Gino Ojic in exchange for Mikhail Anderson and a pick that eventually became not Chris Christopherson. Gino Ojic, solid player, but he only played 13 games for the Flyers. Actually, in fairness, yeah, he was on the Flyers, and then ended up being traded after playing only 17 games the next season to Montreal, whereas Mikhail Anderson, as a member of the Islanders, he played 19 games, so that's a tie. Next up, March 6th of 2000, Calgary acquires Mark Bureau in exchange for Travis Brigley, like Wrigley, but in the brig, and Andre Raisin, Andre Bunch of Raisins. That's a tie. Next trade, though, Mikhail Renberg to the Arizona Coyotes in exchange for Rick Tocchet. Now, Renberg, solid player. Didn't stay in Phoenix. Played 10 games there, went back to Sweden before coming back to the NHL with Toronto. Rick Tocchet, at this point, was at the back half of his career, but did stay in Philadelphia up until the end of it, played 60 games the next season, and then 14 games and retired. So ultimately, I gotta give it as a win to Philadelphia, I guess. It is kind of inconsequential, though. He didn't do much. You know what? No, we'll give it as a win, because the year he got traded there, the Flyers played 18 playoff games. So that's a win. Damn it. It is a win. March 14th of 2000, Atlanta acquires the picks that became Jeff Dwyer and goaltender Pasi Nurminen in exchange for Kirby Law. Now, Nurminen was okay, but he didn't play for all that long. He spent the next 2 seasons in Atlanta, had, over 900 save percentages, nothing spectacular. But then the lockout happened, he went back overseas, and then retired. So that was it for him. Whereas Kirby Law at least spent, 8 games as a member of the Flyers. It has to go to Atlanta for Pasi Nurminen, even though he didn't have the longest career. Kirby Law, again, 8 games, as a member of the Flyers with 1 point, 4 penalty minutes. So could lean towards inconsequential, but for Nurminen, Atlanta wins. Next up, a battle of great names. March 14th of 2000, Carolina acquires Sandy McCarthy in exchange for Kent Manderville. McCarthy played 13 games for the Hurricanes. Manderville stuck around for a bit, decent amount, 24 playoff games in 2 seasons as a member of the Flyers. For that reason, Philly wins this one. May 31st of 2000, Carolina acquires a pick that became Darren Reed in exchange for Paul Ranheim. Now, Ranheim was towards the back half of his career, but still, it's Paul Ranheim in exchange for Darren Reed. Philly wins. June 12th of 2000, Chicago acquires a pick that became Arnie Ramholt in exchange for Mark Janssens. That is a complete wash. June 25th, Tampa acquires a pick that became Johan Haglund in exchange for Roman Cechmanek, John Eichelberger, and Milan Kopechki. This is a win for Philadelphia with Roman Cechmanek. Not the biggest win in the world, but still, it's Roman Cechmanek. So yes, Philly wins. June 25th of 2000, the Flyers acquire a 4th-round pick that would eventually become Jordan Tutu in exchange for John Van Beesbrook. I have to call this a draw. Van Beesbrook only spent half a season, 44 games with the Islanders. He was okay at the time. It was his penultimate season. Jordan Tutu, of course, that we know that deal gets, that pick gets moved in a different deal, not that long down the road, because Philly didn't select Jordan Tutu. So if you want to name a winner, you can, but ultimately, I can't really give it to the Islanders for 44 games of John Van Beesbrook. They didn't make the playoffs that year, so this is going to be a draw. September 26th of 2000, Toronto acquires the rights to Reagan Kelly in exchange for Chris McAllister. Again, it kind of comes down to what do you consider a win? McAllister was a fighter, but at least he was someone. So I gotta give it to Philly, I guess. McAllister did play in at least 2 playoff games for the Flyers. I'm super tempted to just call this a draw, but you know what? Since we've had a couple of draws that, you guess you could define as wins, let's call it a win. September 29th of 2000, Nashville acquires defenseman Mark Eaton in exchange for a third-round pick that becomes Patrick Sharp. Now, Mark Eaton was solid for Nashville, played there up until the 06-07 season, where he eventually went to Pittsburgh and ended up winning a Stanley Cup, of course. Philadelphia, though, Patrick Sharp. And obviously this wasn't the Patrick Sharp, that we would eventually see down the road. It's kind of a tough call, because again, Eaton was a staple on that blue line for the Preds for quite a few years. I don't know how I want to list this one. It's perhaps a little bit controversial. I mean, only 3 seasons worth of games for Sharp. I got to give it to Nashville for Mark Eaton. I have to. He had more of an impact on Nashville than Patrick Sharp had on Philadelphia. December 7th of 2000, Montreal acquires Gino Ojic in exchange for PJ Stock and the pick that would become Dennis Seidenberg. This is a win all day for Philadelphia for the pick that became Dennis Seidenberg. It has to be, and maybe, just maybe, that is my bias for the German Hammer. Maybe it is. Maybe my Bruins bias is showing. But Seidenberg did end up playing, a couple of games here and there, over 100 games for the Flyers before being dealt to the Coyotes, whereas Gino played 36 games for Montreal and then ended up in the AHL. And then, of course, PJ Stock's added in there too, who I also love. He didn't play that much in Philadelphia, had 31 games, but yeah, that's a win for Philly. January 14th of 2000, Pittsburgh acquires Kevin Stevens in exchange for John Slaney. This was at the end of Stevens' career. He played 32 games for Pittsburgh that year, 17 in the playoffs, 32 games the next year, and that was it for him. Whereas John Slaney, he got some games in here and there, but not a ton, mainly an AHL level defenseman. So I am going to call this a win for Pittsburgh, just based off of the fact that, they at least got something out of a playoff run with Kevin Stevens on roster. February 13th of 2001, the Bruins acquire the pick that becomes Marcel Rodman in exchange for the rights to Matt Zoltek. It's a draw. March 13th of 2001, Chicago acquires a pick that became Nicholas Corbeil in exchange for Dean McCammond. McCammond only played 10 games as a Flyer before moving on. He would eventually, of course, be a part of the Calgary Flames near Cup run. Sorry to bring that up, Flames fans, in 03-04, but he didn't do anything for Philadelphia. That's a draw. A few trades here. March 13th as well. Washington acquires Dean Melanson in exchange for Matt Hare. Mikhail Chernoff on May 24th goes to Nashville in exchange for Mike Watt. Also meh. June 23rd, Philly acquires the pick that becomes Jeff Wojciechowski, David Prince, and Tobias Stefan in exchange for Tim Gleason. I would argue, of course, Tim Gleason being the best player in this trade. He never played a game for the Ottawa Senators. Now, as far as, what that trade eventually was for Ottawa, this isn't a trade tree. He was selected by the Sens, but it's not a trade tree. We're going to just call that deal as it stands meh, because otherwise, good God, these videos, for every deal I had to go through the entire trade tree. Next up, on June 23rd of 2001, the same day, Jordan Tutu, at least the pick that became him, is sent to Nashville in exchange for Rob Zepp, Jussi Timonen, and Thierry Duville. Now, Zepp was an okay goalie, but Nashville wins this hands down with Jordan Tutu. Also on June 23rd, Florida acquires the pick that became Andre Medvedev in exchange for Yuri Topita. Meh. Tampa, on the very next day, acquires 2 picks that became Jean-Francois Succi and John Toffey in exchange for Matthew Brunel. Also quite meh. Same day, Tampa acquires Aaron Lobb, Dennis Packard, and a pick that became Paul Lynch for Brett Skinner. Meh. Carolina acquires Rob Zepp the same day for Jesse Lane. Meh. And on the same day, Calgary acquires Dean McCammond for the pick that became Rosario Ruggieri. Big win for the Calgary Flames. Of course, as I mentioned, Dean McCammond, a part of that team that went to the Cup final in 2004. July 1st, 2001, Damon Langkow sent to the, don't call them Phoenix Coyotes, in exchange for a pick that became Dan Spang and the pick that became Jeff Carter. Damon Lankow spent 3 seasons as a member of the Coyotes before going back to the Calgary Flames. Not back to the Calgary Flames, to Calgary. He would go back to the Coyotes in the last year of his career. Jeff Carter, perhaps you could say more about what came after, his career in Philadelphia, with that one, short stint in Columbus before going to the LA Kings. But ultimately, Carter played 6 seasons, 6.5 seasons, really, if you want to count it that way, because he had 55 games before being traded in 2012 with the Flyers, compared to the 3 years for Damon Lankow. That included an 84-point season for Jeff Carter, so this is a win for the Flyers. July 31st of 2001, Nashville acquires defenseman Andy Delmore in exchange for a pick that became Joe Callahan. This is a win for Nashville. Delmore hung around for a bit and was at least a serviceable NHL defenseman. August 20th, 2001, and just off of that date, some Flyers fans might know what this is. Pavel Brendel, Jan Havlak, I've never known how to say his name properly, I'm sorry, and Kim Janssen, as well as a pick that became Stefan Ruzicka, in exchange, essentially, for Eric Lindros. It's a win for the Rangers. It has to be. Brendel, not exactly living up to his potential in the NHL as a former 4th overall pick. Philadelphia, he hung around for a little bit, played 42 games before being dealt to the Carolina Hurricanes. Kim Janssen, decent, but it's the Eric Lindros deal. It's a major win. I don't need to break that down anymore. December 17th of 2001, Vancouver acquires, I'm going to call him Jan, and the pick that became Brett Skinner in exchange for Donald Brashear and a pick that became Yaroslav Balastik. Now, Havlak, for lack of a better term, in terms of saying his name, he hung around for a while, finished out that season in Vancouver, 46 games, 21 points, played 9 games the next year before being moved to the Carolina Hurricanes. Donald Brashear, of course, known as a tough guy. He was an enforcer. He could put up points at times and did for the Flyers and was there up until the 05-06 season. So I got to give it to Philadelphia for the acquisition of Donald Brashear. January 11th, 2002, Nashville acquires Jason Beckett and Peter Hubasek for Yves Saroux. Again, trade. February 13th, Jesse Boulerice to Carolina in exchange for Greg Kohler. You could argue a win for Boulerice, but ultimately a pretty inconsequential trade. Atlanta on March 5th acquires Joe DePenta in exchange for Jared Skalda. I'm guessing it's Skalda. DePenta, NHL level at certain times, but not really with Atlanta. Of course, more known for being on the Ducks roster that ended up winning the Stanley Cup in 2007, but for now, that is an even trade. Atlanta on March 15th, we have another deal between the two, acquired Francis Lassard in exchange for David Harlock, Tyler Redenbach, and the pick that became Joe Pavelski, funny enough. Now, I can't give the Flyers credit for acquiring the pick that became Joe Pavelski, but when you look at the rest of the deal, of course, just because we know that deal was, that pick was involved in another deal, Lassard was okay for Atlanta, and then towards the back half really started to find himself down in the AHL. Atlanta didn't have a single playoff appearance while he was on the roster, so if you want to give it a win, give it to Atlanta, but ultimately I can't. It was really, I'm sorry, Atlanta fans, if there are any left, if there are. March 17th, 2 days later, Pittsburgh acquires Kent Manderville in exchange for Bill Tibbetts. Phenomenal hockey name is Bill Tibbetts. He played 9 games for the Flyers before leaving. Kent Manderville on Pittsburgh. Again, he was not there long, but did play a full 82-game season the next year. Didn't see the playoffs with the Penguins. I'm going to call it even. If you really care and really want to boost Bobby's record, give it to Pittsburgh, or, really want to damage his record, give it to Pittsburgh for Kent Manderville. March 19th, 2002, Washington acquires goaltender Maxime Oulet, former Portland Pirate, by the way. The pick that became Martin Wagner, Maxime Dandino, and Derek Kristanovich for Adam Oates. And ultimately, you gotta really call this one a draw. Oulet didn't really make the NHL at any point. Adam Oates played a grand total of 14 games as a Flyer, 10 points in those 14 games. But yeah, Adam Oates was not what he used to be at this point. June 12, 2002, a fairly notable trade. Arizona acquires goaltender Brian Boucher, and the pick that became Joe Callahan for Robert Esch and Michael Handzus. 2.5 seasons for Boucher, of course, perhaps most notable for ending up back in Philadelphia for the 2010 Cup run, but traded in exchange for Robert Esch, who was a Flyer for the next couple of years, I believe the next 4 seasons after that, and Michael Handzus, who didn't stick around for that. I mean, he played 3 years, went to Chicago, ended up in LA, and then back with the Blackhawks. It's kind of a tough call, but I think this has to be a win for Philadelphia. The goaltenders kind of even out, but Esch and Handzus sticking around for a little bit longer than Boucher did in Arizona gives Philly the win. June 18th of 2002, Edmonton acquires Yuri Dopita in exchange for the pick that became Ryan Potulny. Dopita played 21 games for the Oilers. Potulny bounced around the NHL, but mainly in the AHL for the majority of his career. This one is even. However, June 21st, 3 days later, we get to a major loss for Philly. Tampa acquires Ruslan Fedotenko, Tobias Stefan, and Dan Spang in exchange for the pick that became Yanni Pitkinen. Yanni Pitkinen was a solid NHL defenseman. There is no doubt about that in terms of how much time he spent in Philadelphia. 2 seasons before moving on, actually 3 seasons before moving on to Edmonton, perhaps most known as a member of the Carolina Hurricanes, however. Ruslan Fedotenko won a Stanley Cup 2 years later with the Lightning. Tampa wins that deal. The next day, June 22nd of 2002, Carolina acquires the pick that became Jesse Lane in exchange for Nikita Korovkin, there we go, and Colin Fraser. It's going to be called a draw. Colin Fraser's perhaps the best player in that deal, and he didn't have the most notable NHL career. He does have 2 Stanley Cups, though, so I think that wins out. He wasn't the best player in the world, but he did go on to win 2 Stanley Cups as a member of the LA Kings. But for Philadelphia, yeah, he never played for them, so I believe that pick was moved. Well, actually, it was moved after he was drafted. He was drafted by Philadelphia, but yeah, if we were judging this off of what became of the picks, Colin Fraser, 2-time Stanley Cup champion, although, in the NHL, I believe he had a career-high 17-point season, but ultimately, yeah, this one's a draw. The next day, June 23rd of 2000, Columbus acquires the pick that became Yaroslav Balastik and Steven Gertzen in exchange for David Tremblay. That is a nothing deal, ultimately. We jump all the way ahead to December 6th, where San Jose acquires defenseman Dan McGillis in exchange for Marcus Ragnarsson. Now, McGillis played 37 games for the Sharks, no playoff appearances. Ragnarsson played the next season in Philadelphia before going back to Sweden, but he had multiple playoff appearances, 27 games over the half season he played with Philadelphia and the full season he played with Philadelphia. So I gotta give it to Philly for Ragnarsson. He was a part of a team that helped, get a decent, at least a second round playoff run. December 19th of 2002, Arizona acquires Paul Ranheim for a 2004 conditional pick. No mark as far as what this was. Ranheim only played 40 games for the Coyotes, but again, 40 games versus nothing. We give that one to the Coyotes. January 22nd of 2003, Calgary acquires nothing in exchange for left wing Jamie Wright, who played all of 4 games for the Flyers. So again, you got a player for nothing, but this is still a draw. Next up, January 29th of 2003, the Montreal Canadiens acquire the pick that became Max Lapierre in exchange for Eric Chouinard. Chouinard, spent some time, 28 games, 8 points, 3 points in 17 games the next year. As much as I despise Max Lapierre, he's the better player in this deal, was more serviceable to Montreal ultimately. This is a big win for the Habs. February 5th of 2003, Colorado acquires Chris McAllister in exchange for Ville Hostika. This goes straight to the draw column. 14 games and then 34 games, no points, 62 penalty minutes for McAllister. Again, if you want to give it to Colorado, you can. It's a draw. February 5th of 2003, Vancouver gets nothing in exchange for Todd Warner, who played 13 games, had 5 points for Philadelphia. Didn't see any playoff action, though. I'm going to give it a draw. I mean, again, do you really want to give someone a win off of 13 games? I guess it's better than what Vancouver did. That's going to be a no for me, though. February 7th, 2 days later, Carolina acquires Pavel Brendel and Bruno St. Jacques for Ryan Bast and Sammy Kapanen, and solely for Sammy Kapanen alone, Philadelphia wins this trade. Next up, March 1st, the LA Kings acquire a draft pick that became Patrick Valcak, and Daniel Taylor, that's just goaltender Dan Taylor, in exchange for Dmitry Yushkevich, who played 18 games for the Flyers. So, yeah, that's gonna be a draw. Next up, March 9th, Philly acquires Claude Lapointe, a center who played some games for them in exchange for Evgeny Isakov. So, 14 games, then 13 in the playoffs, 42 games the next year before being sent down to the minors. I'd give it to Philly for Claude Lapointe, although it's not like this drastic win. The next deal, though, is interesting. The next day, March 10th of 2003, Guillaume Lefebvre to Arizona, along with a pick that became Tyler Redenbach and a second-round pick that became Brandon Dubinsky in exchange for Tony Amani. Now, Lefebvre, he didn't really do much for the Coyotes. Matter of fact, he didn't play a single game for the Coyotes, as depressing as that is, which means you are left with Brandon Dubinsky. Now, what they managed to get for Brandon Dubinsky, who was not a draft pick of the Coyotes, of course he was moved to the Rangers, I don't know, because we're not really factoring that in. So basically, was Tony Amani a worthwhile asset to the Flyers? And in this particular deal, he played 13 games and then 13 in the playoffs, 80 games the next season. I got to give it to Philly for the acquisition of Tony Amani. The next deal is an interesting one. It is Chicago getting nothing in exchange for center Peter White. So, Peter, the question is, were you better than nothing? And the answer is, well, you played 3 games and had no points. So the answer is no, that's a draw. May 28th of 2003, the LA Kings acquire Roman Cechmanek in exchange for the pick that became Brian Bickle, which means obviously we know Philly did not keep that pick. Cechmanek, I love him. He only played 49 games for the LA Kings in 03-04. So it's kind of tough. It's kind of tough. I think you gotta give it to the Kings for the Cechmanek deal, but then again, we know Philly moves the pick, and we're going to see what they moved it for later on. So I'm going to give it to LA for now. I'm sorry, but I'm giving it to LA for now. June 21st, Carolina acquires center Marty Murray for Frederick, don't call me Colt, Cabana. And so basically, Marty, did you do anything? You played 66 games and had 12 points before going to Germany for a bit, and then coming back, and then going to Switzerland. We're gonna give it to the Hurricanes for Marty Murray. Let's do that. Why not? Again, that's another one where if you don't want to call it a loss for Philly, cool. If you just want to call it indifferent, go ahead. But this next trade's definitely an example of indifferent. Actually, the next two are, not really. January 22nd, Florida acquires the pick that became Danny Arusin in exchange for Ladislav Skirko. That's a draw. But June 22nd, the same day, in fact, they made quite a few trades. San Jose acquires the, San Jose, somehow, I don't know if this is incorrect or not, if it was, I think this was 2 different trades, but it is ultimately, you know what? No, I know what it is. There were a couple of different trades here. You'll see here, it's on screen for you. So June 22nd, it says Florida acquires Danny Rusin for Skirko, but then it also says that Rusin pick was acquired by the Sharks in exchange for the pick that became Kari Ramo, who of course had some success at the NHL level. I'm just going to judge these as indifferent. I don't know if that's a website thing as far as what that is, but of course Ramo had some success with Tampa and with Calgary. Never stuck around as a member of the Flyers, wasn't drafted by the Flyers. I was drafted by Tampa, so we're just going to call those draws. The next deal, though, is interesting. And in fact, might be the worst trade we've seen yet. The San Jose Sharks acquire a 7th-round pick that becomes Joe Pavelski in exchange for a 6th-rounder that becomes Ladislav Skirko. So again, I don't know what's up with this. I don't know if there were 3-team trades or what. But ultimately, with this deal, yeah, Joe Pavelski becomes a Shark. And right now, I could stop this. Yeah, from Atlanta via Philadelphia. San Jose makes the pick. Philly, you done goofed. San Jose wins that in a big-time way. Next up, Tampa acquires the pick that becomes Ryman's Daliniks and Zbigniew Hurdle for Chris Campoli and John Carter. This is going to be a wash. Campoli wasn't drafted by Philadelphia. He was ultimately drafted by the Islanders in that draft, so I imagine we'll see that come up in the 04 draft a little bit later on. Next deal, June 30th, Dmitry Yushkevich to Washington in exchange for a 7th-round pick. Yushkevich never played a game for the Capitals, so that is also a draw. But we get to the next deal, December 16th. Edmonton acquires defenseman Jeff Wojciechowski, the pick that became Rob Schremp, and the pick that became Danny Savret for Mike Comrie. Comrie didn't stick around in Philadelphia. He played 21 games before going to the Coyotes. Jeff Wojciechowski didn't stick around on Edmonton. He ended up being a member of the St. Louis Blues. This one is going to be a draw. Next trade, December 17th, the final trade of 03. Minnesota acquires Eric Chouinard in exchange for a pick that became Chris Zarb. Chouinard, I mean, I think you have to give it to Philly or to Minnesota. I mean, he played 31 games for Minnesota, so if you really wanted to give it to Minnesota, we're going to call this a draw as well. First trade of 2004. We're still just grinding away on this here. Justin Williams goes to the Carolina Hurricanes in exchange for Danny Markov. Markov played 34 games, for the Philadelphia Flyers. Justin Williams would win a Stanley Cup in Carolina. What we learned here is that Bobby Clarke should not be allowed to trade with the Carolina Hurricanes. January 22nd of 2004, Philadelphia acquires Matthias Tiemander, a defenseman, in exchange for what would ultimately become a defenseman, Chris Campoli. Tiemander played 34 games for the Flyers, 18 playoff games. Philadelphia went to the conference final that year, easy for me to say, before losing to the Tampa Bay Lightning. Campoli spent quite a few seasons, 4 seasons, with the Islanders before moving on to the Ottawa Senators, and then his career kind of continued to fall apart from there. So do you judge a little bit more mileage out of Campoli, or the fact that Tiemander was a part of a team that went to the conference final, just for the fact that Tiemander fell apart and then went back to Sweden, played for Modo a lot to wind out his career? I'm going to give it to the Islanders for Chris Campoli. February 9th of 2004, St. Louis acquires Eric Weinrich in exchange for a pick that became Gino Pessalini. Gino. Yeah, this is a win for St. Louis. Weinrich didn't spend that long on the Blues, 26 games that year, and then after the lockout, 59 games before being traded to the Canucks. But he was a former Portland Pirate and went to the University of Maine. Go Black Bears. So Eric Weinrich wins this deal for St. Louis. Also on February 9th, the Arizona Coyotes acquire Mike Comrie in exchange for Sean Burke, the rights to Ben Eager, and Branko Radiosevic. Now, with Comrie, he wasn't a Yote for that long. Played the next year and eventually ended up with the Islanders, whereas Sean Burke also wasn't a Flyer for that long. He played 15 games. And as far as what happened with Ben Eager and a good old Branko, of course, I think Eager most well known as a member of the Edmonton Oilers. Ultimately, though, did spend 3 seasons in Philadelphia before moving on to Chicago, where he'd eventually win a Stanley Cup. And then with Branko Radiosevic, I know some Flyers fans remember him well. He spent, a couple of not really that long cup of coffee. Ended up in Minnesota as well. So it's kind of even. It really is like, okay, do you give it to Ben Eager? Like, the Flyers get the edge for Ben Eager? Probably. I'm going to call this one a draw. If you really wanted to name a winner, I'd lean towards Philadelphia. I'm going to call this one a draw, though. February 16th of 2004, Dallas acquires Mike Siklanka for Steve Gainey. It's a draw. Just the name value alone, it's a draw. February 19th, 2004, we get a big win. and it's not for Philly. Chicago acquires Jim Vandermeer, the pick that eventually becomes Brian Bickle, and the rights to Colin Frazier in exchange for Alexei Zhamnov and Michael R.J. Anderson. Zhamnov was not a Flyer for long. He'd end up being a Bruin post-lockout. Brian Bickle wins this nearly single-handedly for the Blackhawks. March 8th of 2004, Dallas acquires defenseman Chris Therien in exchange for the picks that became Martin Houle and Chris Lawrence. It's a draw. Therien would play 11 games for Dallas and actually end up back in Philadelphia post-lockout. Also on March 8th, the Flyers acquired Vladimir Malakoff in exchange for Rick Kozak and the pick that would become Andrei Pavlik. Now, Malakoff didn't stay in Philly long. Kozak was a minor leaguer. Pavlik not selected ultimately by the Rangers. This is going to be a draw. June 27th, Tampa acquires the pick that became Brandon Elliott, Jan Zeplatal, and goaltender Kari Ramo for the pick that became Oscars Bartulis. So pretty much this is Bartulis v. Ramo. And, you know, I mean, I'm probably going to give it to Tampa for Ramo. Bartulis plays to this day. He's only 33 years old. At the NHL level, though, didn't stick around long. 53 games in 09-10, and then 13 games the following year. So I'm going to give it to Tampa for Ramo, ultimately. I mean, you could say, Bartulis and what Philly did in 2010, but meh. Next up, there was a loan trade between Arizona and Philly. Peter White to Arizona, John Sim to the Flyers. We'll call that a deal, you know, an even deal. July 27th of 2005, Anaheim acquires Todd Fedoruk in exchange for a pick that became Pierre-Olivier Pelletier. Fun name to say. Fedoruk, though, didn't stick around with Anaheim long. Played 76 games in 05-06, 10 games the next year. If you really wanted to, you could make this a win for Anaheim. Had Fedoruk been a part of the, a big part of the cup-winning team, I probably would have given it to Anaheim, but I'm going to call it a draw. July 30th, 2005, Florida acquires a first-round pick that becomes Kendall McArdle, who ultimately didn't really pan out, in exchange for a pick that became Steve Downey and a pick that became Corey Emerton. I'm going to call this a draw. I mean, McArdle just didn't really crack out for the Panthers. Steve Downey's a gigantic douche. Corey Emerton was, he bounced back and forth a little bit. This is going to be a draw. Also on July 30th, Tampa acquires a pick that becomes Chris Lawrence and a pick that becomes Blair Jones in exchange for a second-round pick that becomes Sean Mathias. Of course, that wouldn't stick with Philadelphia. Mathias drafted by the Detroit Red Wings. Blair Jones was okay at times, actually drafted by Tampa, stuck around for a bit. I think I got to give this to Tampa for the acquisition of Blair Jones, although you could really call it a draw if you wanted to. I'm going to call it a draw. Jones was okay, but nothing great. Also on July 30th, Arizona acquires the pick that became Pierre-Olivier. I got to imagine it's Pierre-Olivier Pelletier in exchange for the pick that became Jeremy Duchesne and Andreas Nodal. I'll give it to Philly for the acquisition of Andreas Nodal. August 2nd, Nashville acquires defenseman Danny Markov in exchange for the third-round pick that became Bud Holloway. That pick is then dealt 2 days later alongside Jeremy Roenick to the LA Kings for future considerations that were never named. Now, the Nashville part of the deal, I mean, Markov only played 58 games for them, but I would consider it a win for the Preds, much like I would consider it a win for the Kings. Now, I mean, Jeremy Roenick wasn't a King for long, 58 games. Bud Holloway never really panned out, but still, 58 games of Jeremy Roenick for nothing? Yes, please. Next up, December 5th, 2005, this deal hurts a lot. Eric Mellock and Patrick Sharp for Matt Ellison and the pick that became Ryan White. Yes, Philly had a lot to do with building the team that they lost to in 2010. Just a fact. Big win for Chicago. December 28th, Eric Chouinard to Arizona for Keel McLeod. Meh. January 20th, Arizona gets Dennis Seidenberg, a pick that became Thomas Marchenko, and a nothing deal, not exercise pick for Peter Nedved and Eunice Letiviori. It's got to be Seidenberg, because Nedved was pretty much out of gas at this point. Didn't stay, left, came back. It's got to be Arizona for the Seidenberg pickup. January 23rd of 2006, the Florida Panthers acquired John Sim in exchange for the pick that became Patrick Maroon. Sim played just 33 games for the Panthers, did not see the playoffs. Maroon, of course, never suited up for the Flyers, eventually being involved in a deal that sent him to Anaheim. I'm going to call this an even trade. March 9th, 2006, San Jose acquires the pick that would eventually become Tom Sestito in exchange for Nico Dimitrakos. Tom Sestito is a douche. Nico Dimitrakos has a phenomenal name. Philly wins just because. March 9th as well, Arizona acquires Josh Gratton, the pick that became Corey Emerton and Sean Matthias, in exchange for Denis Gauthier, who only played 17 games for the Flyers that season, 43 the next, ended up in the AHL. It wasn't a great end to the former Calgary Flames defenseman's career for the Coyotes. I mean, Sean Matthias, not exactly known for being a yote. That's going to be an even trade. Next up, though, June 24th, Montreal acquires the pick that became Ryan White in exchange for Jonathan Matsumoto and Jakub, not Voracek, but Kovar. Montreal wins that deal for the pickup of Ryan White. August 2nd, Chicago acquires Vaclav Pletka for Eric Mellock. Mellock at this point, I mean, yeah, he played 13 games for the Flyers in 06-07. That's an even trade. And that brings us to the final deal. And there is a player that we've mentioned before that is involved in this trade. Fun fact. 1-for-1, Chicago acquires Michael Handzus for Kyle Calder. Handzus, at this point, didn't stay in Chicago. He didn't. He played 8 games for that team and then went to the Kings, whereas Kyle Calder played 59 games and then went to the Kings. So the winner of this trade is the LA Kings. And with that, we have our final tally: 155 trades, 26 wins, 32 losses, and 97 draws. Not the most impressive record at first glance, but I think it's better in some ways than it appears. I mean, obviously, with the amount of draws, you could always give some extra wins or losses here and there, as we talked about, which means that win-loss total was always going to be close and was always going to be dwarfed by the amount of nothing trades that we saw throughout the video. I think what stands out the most was Clarke's drive to push the team closer and closer towards cup contention from the very moment that he took control of the team. Of the 4 times throughout his 11 seasons that the Flyers made it to the conference final, 3 of those occasions were prior to the Lindros trade, those years being 95, 97, and 2000. 97, of course, being the year that they fell short in the cup final to the Detroit Red Wings. But whether it be Howard, Chuck, or Hextall, he always seemed to want to add that piece that could have been the missing piece towards pushing the team over the edge, and of course that much closer to a Stanley Cup. On the flip side, his big mistakes turned out to be very big mistakes, particularly with the Carolina Hurricanes, Brendan Moore and Williams, and with the Chicago Blackhawks, Sharp and Bickle, although of course with the latter, that didn't really come into play until after Clarke was out as GM. Overall, when it comes to Bobby Clarke's trading history, it's middle of the road, much like the record. There was bound to be a ton of inconsequential trades over the course of an 11-year tenure. The wins nearly won him a cup. The losses, or at least some of them, played a big part in 2 teams winning a cup instead. I said it a lot in this video, but I grade his trading history as meh. But let me know what you think down in the comments below. How do you grade Clarke's tenure overall? What were his biggest victories, his biggest defeats? Is there a trade, or several perhaps, that you think I graded improperly? I'd love to know, especially if you made it all the way through this marathon of a video. You know the deal though. If you did enjoy, drop a like, subscribe if you have not already done so. It would be greatly appreciated. And as always, check out everything in the description if you have not already done so. All the socials, Twitch, Discord, and of course, Patreon. And a shout out to all my patrons who voted on this video to be a thing. Tier 2 subscribers or Tier 2 patrons are able to do that. And indeed, we'll see what video comes next. Will it be another draft class, redrafting? Will it be another GM trade history? Time will ultimately tell. For now, though, I thank you very much for watching. Until next time, have a good one. Take it easy. I'll see you then.